Hey everyone, it's Ellis, and this is the yearly Worlds video that I obviously do every single year, where I talk about the champions. And obviously, for people that have followed my stream or Twitter or something, I did say that I would make 2 tier lists. However, the second tier list will not be in this video. The second tier list will probably end up being done on stream, which is going to be basically what I expect the pro player perceptions of the people that are going to play in the tournament. What I think is, or actually, it's not even really their perception. It's just what I imagine is going to be the tendency of the pro players, knowing how like spring split, summer split, and everything else has ended up going, and what that'll end up meaning for like the trajectory. Now, I do think that some of the things on this list honestly could probably be changed if anyone's been following Champions Queue and been seeing the way that some of these champions have been being itemized, such as Fimble Winterless Maokai. We have Turbo Cumtank Hecarim, and that one's obviously not a very good look. There's a lot of other monstrosities that are absolutely being seen in terms of itemization and whatnot. But without further ado, let's just get into it all. So, Fiora, in her current state, is really broken. She has really good matchups into so many champions that are just very prevalent right now inside of the meta. Maokai is obviously going to be very popular. I think that if you play Fiora well enough, she's just way too good. Now, obviously, one of her downsides would be that she can't team fight, but, I mean, that's not totally true. It's much harder to team fight on Fiora, and she's still probably the scariest champion in the game if she gets ahead. I actually do not think that there is any scarier champion than a Fiora in any lane, any role, whatever, if Fiora actually is ahead. So Fiora's Z-tier placement is just because I think that the current state of the game and all of the surrounding champions' power levels, I think Fiora ends up coming out on top. Gangplank is obviously there, along with Maokai, who has made a resurgence now since his mini rework, and they'll just be probably very high up on the list. Now, I'm not actually sure if Gangplank is going to get as much love as he properly should, and, you know, I mean, that's just the way that it goes with Gangplank. A lot of people forget how broken he is. We'll talk about some of the other standouts, though. Aatrox with the Eclipse and the Nuker build offers him a lot of different variations for how he can itemize, and that allows him to do different things and play different ways inside of the lane. Let's talk about some of the non-standard placements. Obviously, you have stuff like Azir in top lane. We did see Azir top lane in LCK briefly, and I think that we even saw it in LCS. I can't totally remember, but obviously Azir in top lane has some good matchups against a lot of the very popular champions. He's still going to be relatively strong, and I mean, this is also primarily like one of the best or better answers against like Gangplank and stuff. Vayne is obviously here just because of the way that she fares as one of the few marksmen that just does really well, has a lot of survivability inside of top lane. And then obviously we have Ivern, who top lane not quite as good as mid lane, mostly because of his inability to utilize both of the buffs. Daisy loses some value because, you know, you're not aiming to control Dragon as much, but Ivern still has really powerful laning phase that is extremely difficult to move. Some of the other top lane champions that I think some people might be like wondering about, Bel'Veth is obviously on this list because I do think that mid and top are her better roles than jungle, and I think that there's some other video on YouTube that I ended up talking about why I believe that that is the case. You have other like fringe things like Rammus on the list versus like really heavy AD compositions. We are still seeing a lot of Kalista instead of solo queue and champions queue for God knows what reason. And so depending on like certain things, like maybe Rammus could come out, it's not actually just like a boss special where it's like totally memey and whatnot. Lilia obviously has a lot of value because there's a lot of tanks that are prevalent inside of the meta. And then there's other, you know, obscure random champion picks here. Some of the things that, you know, some people might be a little bit upset about because of how popular the champions were is like Sejuani being so down, but really Sejuani should have stopped being picked like way earlier on because her best role is probably just support in most cases. Other like really fringe things in C tier, I think C is mostly just fringe tier things in general, and then obviously the don't tier does feature the Lucian, and I mean even Aphelios in the current state of affairs. I think that Vayne and Akshan is just going to be inherently a lot better. And then, you know, I did these lists on stream with like various other people. Draven also is going to be in C right now just because of, again, the dynamic of top lane right now. I think that Vayne and Akshan are going to fill that one out. So move on to the jungle. And like everything in the jungle every single year, it has been pretty similar, and yet it's never actually reflective of pro play. But again, champion tier list that I end up making is a representation of the champion's inherent power. And obviously, when your laners are not going to want to play around you, and they're not going to want to play the game the way that the champion is going to have to play the game, and they get a little bit upset because they messed up in their lane, and they want you to demand that they come bail them out, or they just want to play poorly and be able to get away with it because their jungler is just not going to elect to farm because the champion's base power level in mid game and late game is not super strong. Well, that's what ends up happening, and that's why a lot of the champions on the list that have been very prevalent in pro play, like Trundle and Vi, end up being a lot more popular, even like Wukong. I think that these champions are absolutely dog water in pretty much all cases. I think if you actually look at the pro games and you watch what these champions are having to do in order to find value or effectiveness, or just watch what actually happens to the champions if they're ever on even footing in most of the games, and the same cannot be said for a lot of the champions in higher tiers, because when these champions are on even footing, their value and their transformative value inside of games is going to be much, much, much higher. A lot of these champions have either received mini reworks, which is like the Hecarim stuff, or they've just, Hecarim, Maokai jungle even, or they've just received a lot of indirect buffs or just outright buffs like Fiddlesticks and whatnot. So I think that the Z tier is pretty self-explanatory. In most cases that I've done these tier lists, this does not really change. Some of the champions do have conditions, obviously. I think that Fiddlesticks is less dependent on being isolated magic damage. I think that is a theory that some people have, that, if you're going to have Fiddle inside of your team, then you want him to just be isolated magic, but I don't think that's actually the case just because of his inherent value. Kindred is very, very well versed in the meta right now in terms of how many team compositions that she can just disrupt. If you take Ghost on Kindred in certain matchups, certain jungle dynamics, 2v2s, etc., become totally fine and totally playable, and Kindred's going to be fine. For people that are wondering why Udyr is not on this list, it's because he's not allowed at Worlds. Some of the other stuff is obviously like Ivern being there because enchanters are just always absolutely broken. Xin Zhao's inherent base power is really good, but when you pick Xin Zhao to just be a stat checker in the early game without any enchanters or anything to back him up, he's going to fall off a cliff, but that doesn't actually affect his base power because his base power stays really sturdy for a really long time, and then he just continues to need an enchanter in order to carry on over into being like an S tier, borderline Z tier champion, and that's just the way that Xin ends up working. Maokai and Shyvana, I think, are pretty fine as well. We saw a lot of Shyvana actually popping up in solo queue, both in jungle as well as in top lane. I think that Shyvana is just a superior version of Bel'Veth. And so while I do have Bel'Veth at like C tier, Bel'Veth is hyper-dependent on a lot of things, and often it's not the champion itself that is really being picked. If you're picking Bel'Veth, it likely means that you have 3 winning lanes, and that's why you can get away with playing Bel'Veth, so that you're able to free farm and get a lot of stacks, as well as have really good neutral objective control, like Dragons and Heralds, so that you can reliably get the transforms. But if you're doing that, then you should probably just be Shyvana, because Shyvana is going to scale a lot better than a jungle Bel'Veth. Some of the other things here is Darius. For a lot of people that have not seen, Darius has an absolutely brokenly fast, absurd clear speed inside of the jungle. And it only gets better when you really learn how to juggle his patience combined with his bleed passive. His jungle clear speed gets absolutely berserk. So if you actually want a champion that has really good early game power and that curves well into mid game and just does a lot of disruption all across the board that is not as absolutely garbage tier as some of the champions below him, Darius is actually the guy, but I just don't think that pro players are actually going to pick him up. Especially because a lot of the champions, again, in the meta right now that are very good, and Darius has flex potency. Some of the other stuff that is on here that might, confuse some people. Taric, again, really, really healthy clear speed inside of the jungle. The nerfs that Taric ended up getting were not actually enough to move him or harm him inside of the jungle. The champion is just inherently really, 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 really strong. Some of the other stuff that we continue to move down on, Nocturne in B tier. So Nocturne is kind of like a Smoj champion. Most people don't really itemize him that well. They end up building like Stridebreaker and then full tank, and you just cry inside. And then you wonder why people are even picking him when Nocturne's, ratios were buffed, and then people actually don't itemize that. Always reminds me of when Xayah had her crit chance buffed, but then everyone built lethality and never built crit, except for based Lord Danny, who did end up building crit. A lot of the other don't tiers in this list, I don't expect really any of of them to really pop up are just really gimmicky junglers that, you know, have a very high dependency on extremely high variance, or they're just really, really, really slow, and I just don't think that you should actually utilize it. Cho'Gath, I mean, yes, Pentaflex potential, but it just really, you don't do it. And then the L tier stands for hopefully lost tier, is definitely Nidalee and Lee Sin, because these champions are absolutely dog water, and I would actually, unironically, prefer to see any other champion above them on the list picked than those two champions. So we move on now to the mid lane, where everyone's going to get real excited. So coming in hot yet again, Ivern in the Z tier position, along with Seraphine and Ziggs. Ivern, I obviously am not doing the same level of testing or experiments that was going on like in December and January, but from things that I've, you know, been told, as well as just continuing to see what goes on, I don't think that really anything's changed for Ivern's matchups with any of the, you know, balance changes to various champions. I think that it is almost guaranteed that he can, with complete control over himself, go 50-50 or win most lanes. And so that's where a lot of his strength comes in, because you get to run double enchanter team compositions, really, really broken with a lot of junglers, and it's just so valuable being able to have a champion like that in mid lane that is able to function on such low economy, curve so much faster than the opponents, and have such ridiculously inherent base scaling combined with even item scaling that comes online so fast. So really can't be understated, but yes, I do not expect to see any Ivern mids, because people do not want to bother to take the time to learn him, and he is an awkward thing. And also, if you play him like you play any other champion, then you're going to have a bad time. If you try to play a control deck like an aggro deck, you are going to get smacked in the face, and then you're going to blame the deck and say that your deck sucks, when without failing to realize that it wasn't the deck that made it so that you could not get Mythic on MTG Arena, or even past rank 10 on Hearthstone, okay? So we move on to Sarah Queen. Now, Sarah Queen obviously has a couple of, you know, flex potencies. I think enchanters are just really broken. I think that, again, much like Ivern, she can just fade a lot of things that, you know, could cause her problems. The reason that Ziggs I have placed in Z tier is because Ziggs is really one of the best answers against most of the champions A and up. Ziggs is just really good, not only against the lane opponents that he would be facing inside of mid lane. He's very good against a lot of the 80 carries, and also against a lot of the supports that we're going to end up getting to later. He's very, very self-sufficient, and he's able to just do a lot on his own. And S tier, Cassiopeo, very well versed inside, very well placed right now inside of the game with the itemization, and again, with jungle and top laners being the way that they are, as well as even 80 carries, Cassiopea has a very good time. Orianna, I think, rises in power just because of the utility, as well as some of the other, like, junglers and whatnot. Corki should not be slept on, and then obviously Vel'Koz is here, even though I just don't think anyone's really going to pick him. And then when you move down into the A tier, you start to get some more, like, other control-y type of champions that, you know, they have their own place. Now, the problem is that a lot of these champions that you see in the A tier inherently just lose to S tier champions, or they have a little bit more dependency on variables inside of their team compositions than maybe some of the other champions above them. That doesn't offset maybe some of their own individual laning stuff that they would end up requiring, and so that's the reason for their placement. Some of the things probably could have been moved around, but just didn't end up doing it. Sylas on B tier, I think, is something that I've talked about a lot in regards to Sylas, just because Sylas feels really, really good to play, and people do blind pick him, and then they build him, you know, a million different ways and whatnot. I don't think the champion's actually great if you actually look at what's happening inside of the game. And then the argument ends up going back to, like, the jungle when talking about Wukong and Vi and everything like that, in regards to talking about the champion, when you see the champion on even footing compared to any of these champions that naturally load into the game ahead. And so I think that's good. Akshan, I don't really expect to see him, but I figured that I would place him here. Zoe is on B tier, but you will see on support that she is extremely high up, because I think that support is her best role. Belbus is here in mid lane on B tier, just because of her easy access to the Raptor camp, as well as close proximity to both the neutral objectives and including Scuttle Crab. And so it's very easy, as well, the proximity to the two turrets, for her to play a war of attrition in mid lane against a lot of the mages and attack their mana pool and just remain very, very healthy. So I do think that mid is probably Belveth's best role, followed by top, and then ultimately jungle, and then obviously we have more like standard mages and bruisers and whatnot here. Almost all of the C tier champions, they're either hyper dependent on things, or they're just outright really gimmicky and their inherent value is just not there to justify them. I could actually see myself moving Galio a little bit higher into B, but other than that, so many of these champions are so uber omega conditional on things, or they just have better placings in other roles that isn't mid lane. And then obviously the don't tier. The don't tier is mostly reserved for champions that either, like, it is so inconceivable to imagine that they would be picked in the game, or they need more than just like the stars to align. They need the multiverse to align or something in order to justify these champions from really getting picked. We have been seeing, oddly, some like weird amount of Vex popping up inside of solo queue. If you check like the win rate stats websites everywhere, Vex is like ever. This champion is absolutely dog water, even more so after the durability update, and nothing that ended up happening made her any better. She will literally single-handedly lose you games in competitive if you end up picking her, and a lot of other champions on this list are pretty much the same, like Fizz, Pantheon, Syndra, etc. in mid lane, and then Smoge, Katarina. Cat Evolve needs to get into Champions Queue, true. And then we move on to AD carry. So, a couple of things about AD carry. On this tier list maker, I cannot splice an image. So Lux is actually a placeholder for Lux Seraphine as a combo. Now, Lux Seraphine as a combo is very, very strong against pretty much every single bot lane duo, but I think that it has higher potency because Lux Seraphine absolutely dominates Caitlyn, which I expect to be the premier AD carry coming into the World Championship 2022. So Caitlyn, with a lot of the changes that she ended up getting, as well as things that are happening around her, all the other marksmen just continuing to get hit, Caitlyn's mid and late game are just buffed up. Caitlyn is just looking like she's going to literally come out as the #1 AD carry. Following her is likely going to be Ashe and Misfortune. I think that these two are ones that have definitely been popping up a lot. Misfortune been seeing a lot of play on Champions Queue because of her build. She's very versatile in terms of how she can build. She pairs well with a lot of champions, very good against the meta, and just generally just a very good champion. It's just a sad thing that a lot of people get bored. Kaiser, if you guys saw the casual coaching thingy with Fnatic Upset, you guys would have seen that the Kaiser placement is in regards to the full attack speed Kaiser build that allows her to be a lot more nimble in team fights and grant her just a lot more positioning, survivability, and thus ultimately damage output and all those other great things. So that's what goes on for Kaiser there. And then Senna, even though she ended up getting nerfed earlier in the year, you can never really underestimate Senna's scaling, as well as, her ability to do the Senna pairings and stuff. The problem is there's probably less than 5 people in the world that play Senna really well in bot lane, and not even all of them are at this tournament, so that is going to be a really, really sad thing. There's been some really sick Senna performances out of LEC this past split. Targamas, I think, was one of the best Senna performances that I ever saw in recent times. It literally looked like Reckless. It was absolutely crazy, and so maybe we could look forward to seeing Senna there. And then a lot of the other AD carries I think do make sense. Obviously, in the don't tier, Kalista, again, I mean, this champion is absolute. I could make an entire video about how dog water this champion is and how the whole philosophy of her being predicated on getting ahead in early lane or having some sort of early lane control, and then if one thing just goes wrong, everything goes belly up. And even then, it's not as consistent as a lot of the other lane bullies. That's the other really big problem with the whole Kalista thing, that it is so weird. Generally, if a lane bully is predicated on getting ahead, if it truly can always get ahead and it's on them to mess up or blunder or something, it's a little bit of a different argument. But Kalista, with everything going on, I can't actually put her. I mean, she's just don't tier, just like Jhin. And then a lot of these other champions here, either dependency on base levels or just, the marksman role not really being their best position is pretty much what's going on there. Now, some of the combos. Now, you notice that I titled them SSA. So Rengar Ivern is really, really, really strong. No one's going to learn it. That's totally fine. The other one, Kindred Taric. There was a video about Kindred Taric prior to Riot doing the Apex tier MMR nerfing of the Challenger Kindred Taric Chinese duo that ended up dominating the Korean ladder, playing the Kindred Taric combo. Both of these champions absolutely broken, absolutely absurd scaling, absolutely nutsoid combo. And I mean, that's not here. Also, Pyke Taric could be another one that's here, and then Cho'Gath X is another combo that I think is a little bit less powerful because of a lot of the long-range mages as well as AD carries in the meta right now, but it is worth noting that Cho'Gath should be placed there. We move on to support. So, lo and behold, welcome to the League of Enchanters. All right, so Soraka, Sona, Janna, and Senna at the Z tier position. I don't think this really needs that much of an explanation. I understand that the representation is likely going to actually be more with like Nautilus being picked, or Leona, and I mean Carrier was playing Thresh yesterday, even though literally his buffs ended up equating to like 2 auto attacks worth of HP, which is just laughable because that should never ever be the reason that you do or don't pick a champion in this support role. It's very funny, especially when you consider what Thresh's main value is or what his main purpose is. And then also some of the champions that Thresh would have been good against ended up actually getting nerfed. And so that is what is going on there. Sona, the best scaling enchanter in the entire game. It really can't be understated just how powerful she is. But Soraka definitely has a better array of matchups inside of the meta right now. So all things are good on that front. Zillion, Yuumi, Bard, Lux, etc. These are, I think, all relatively standard. The one that might really stand out is Zoe, and for that, I think that there is the Zoe Trimby casual coaching videos that exist on the YouTube. Ever since the Zoe change, where now she's able to take spell thieves, and the AD carry can last hit the balloons and give her the spells, it's really broken. This in addition to Paddle Star, which means that she has way more mana to spam inside of the laning phase. Her level 1 power with E is absolutely absurd. Her level 2 power is absolutely broken, and then much like Xerath in the support role, mid Zoe and support Zoe doesn't really have that much of a difference at 1 and 2 items, almost at all, and support Zoe can come online really fast, and she fulfills everything that mid Zoe would end up doing. Mid Zoe would have a lot worse matchups than a support Zoe, whereas a support Zoe can be a lot more bullying, and I just think this is genuinely her best role, and I do think that we might actually get some support players from Western regions that might actually pull out Zoe at Worlds, and so I'm excited and looking forward to that. Blitzcrank is one of the few, like, somewhat cheesy engage pick, champions that survived, I think, the durability patch thing. Nasus is obviously here. I don't think Nasus really needs an introduction. He's been appearing even in Champions Queue. We did this stuff with Trimby. I mean, Riot literally pulled the buffs to him because I think there's actually uncertainty surrounding Nasus support, which is hilarious because this literally all started technically 2 years ago, right, in the scrims that we ended up doing against the LCK Academy teams, where it was me and Wind, and I ended up picking Nasus support in bot lane against Kalista, and then it sort of spiraled. Trimby started playing it, and then we got more people to play it, and then we played it last year as well on stream scrims and whatnot, and, here we are today, and now Nasus support is having Riot worry about its power and actually pull the buffs that it was to receive on the Worlds patch. So I think that's really interesting. Do not play it in solo queue. You will absolutely hate your life with AD carries, and AD carries will hate you too because no one knows why you're playing Nasus support, and you probably don't either, and that's fine. So we move on, and Lulu definitely got hit a little bit. It's really hard to place her lower than this, though, when you consider a lot of the champions in B tier are like... They're kind of, I don't want to say cheesy, but they're not honest. I think that Renata can definitely be higher in some situations, but I think that most of the champions in B tier just fall flat to a lot of the champions in AS and Z, and I think that the champions playing in AS and Z can definitely play much more honest games, and that they will be better in a wider array of situations. And, support in itself is a little bit awkward in that support really does care about a lot of dynamics, and so it's a little bit difficult to talk about some of the more specific things. That's pretty much it. Maokai is obviously still here, even though he's in jungle and top lane. I think that's, totally fine. Singed is something that might legitimately come out by Gen G. Singed support was actually picked several times in the LCK. I do think that Shaco's support has inherently a lot of value. I think that even Zig's support, I think Sejuani, this is actually her best role. Renata and Ashe are probably the two that could be a little bit higher. AP support Twitch is something. And then obviously all of the champions that got really slammed by the durability update or just are inherently, I think, very, very bad at almost all stages of the game, unless, again, the predicated on, just assuming that you're going to get ahead of the opponent and, philosophy. Braum could maybe be higher, but I think that's pretty much it. And then obviously the don't tier is just champions that I think function really, really, really poorly. There's probably a world where Set could be a little bit higher, but we're not gonna. That world is not today. And so that is it for the tier list. And I want to thank all the pro players and other high MMR players that came on the stream and obviously helped with the consulting of making these various lists and whatnot, and doing that over the course of the last week. And I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. Again, this is not representative of solo queue, nor is this representative of what I think the actual players playing at the tournament will end up selecting, and for that I will end up doing an entirely different list just to appease the people on Reddit and Twitter and etc. that say that I don't consider or acknowledge what they're acknowledging, because I do. I just think it's bad, and that's fine. So we'll make two lists, and this is my usual yearly Worlds competitive tier list. I hope you enjoyed.